The letter arrived on the morning her mother died. Evangeline held it between trembling fingers, the cream-colored envelope pristine and anachronistic against the sterile hospital room. Outside, November rain hammered against reinforced glass, and somewhere in the walls, machines kept her mother's failing heart mechanical and stubborn. The postmark was dated 3 weeks prior, carefully timed, she would later realize. Deliberately orchestrated. To the last of the Ashford line, it began in script so ornate it seemed written in another era. Your inheritance awaits in Perdition Hall. Come alone. Come before the blood moon wanes. Her mother's hand, skeletal and paper-thin, gripped her wrist. Don't go, her mother whispered, though her eyes had already begun to cloud with morphine in the approach of whatever lay beyond. Don't ever go to perdition. They'll tell you it's your blood right. It's a lie. It's a cage. Evangeline pressed her mother's hand to her cheek, feeling the coldness, already creeping into her skin, death preparing its slow invasion. Mama, what are you talking about? Who will tell me? But her mother's lips sealed shut, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the room, beyond the waking world. She died 17 minutes later without speaking again, leaving only that cryptic warning and the burning weight of the unopened letter. 3 weeks of funeral arrangements, of relatives she barely knew, making expressions of sympathy that felt rehearsed, of sorting through a lifetime compressed into a small apartment in London. And then, because the alternative was returning to her job at the museum where she catalogued dead things and felt increasingly like one of them, Evangeline rented a car and drove north. The GPS signal died 20 kilometers from the estate. The roads had grown progressively narrower, the Yorkshire moorland increasingly wild. Stone walls appeared and disappeared like ribs through a dying land's thin skin. The sky, bruised purple, and charcoal, seemed to press downward. And then, around a curve marked by 2 granite pillars carved with symbols she didn't recognize, astronomical or mystical, she couldn't be sure the manor appeared as though it had always been there, waiting in the perpetual twilight. Perdition Hall was not beautiful. It refused beauty the way a scar refuses to be pretty. The Victorian Gothic architecture seemed to grow upward in defiance of the moors themselves, all sharp angles and turrets, stone blackened by centuries of wind and rain. Gargoyles leered from corners. The windows were small, deeply recessed, like eyes squinting against unbearable light. Ivy consumed the eastern wing in a slow, botanical siege, and at the apex of the central tower, a weather vane shaped like a raven pointed toward some unseen north that had nothing to do with magnetism. The drive curved through a once grand garden now surrendered to wildness. Roses bloomed in defiant reds and blacks. The fountain at the center was empty and cracked, ringed with moss. And everywhere on the steps, on the balustrades, embedded in the gravel, Evangeline saw symbols. Circles within circles. Stars with too many points. Marks that seemed to pulse when she wasn't looking directly at them. She sat in the car for 10 minutes before finding the courage to step out. The air smelled of earth and rain and something else, something sweet and copper dark that made her mouth dry. The wind carried it, and with the wind came a sensation she could only describe as recognition. Her blood seemed to quicken. Her skin prickled with an awareness that wasn't quite fear, wasn't quite longing, but something molten existing in the space between them. The front doors were oak, reinforced with iron, marked with more of those symbols. As Evangeline climbed the steps, her footfalls echoing against stone, she became aware of being watched. Not by eyes she saw no movement in any window, but with a presence so profound it seemed the house itself had drawn breath and was holding it. The doors opened before she touched them. Inside, candlelight bloomed in candelabras positioned impossibly throughout the foyer. They couldn't have ignited on their own, yet she'd seen no one light them. The entrance hall rose 3 stories, ringed by a gallery. A grand staircase split into 2 curves, ascending into shadows. And dominating the center of the floor, inlaid in black marble against white, was a symbol so large and intricate it took her breath. A circle of flame surrounding a single eye, and beneath it, words in Latin so ancient the stone seemed to remember when it was carved. Sanguis veritas lux aeterna. Blood, truth, eternal light. Welcome home, Miss Ashford. The voice moved through the space like smoke, settling into her bones before she understood she'd heard it. Evangeline spun, her heart a trapped bird in her chest. He stood at the top of the staircase, silhouetted against candlelight, and for a moment the moment she saw him as something other than human, a creature of elegant darkness, a predator arranged in the shape of a man. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw only a man, tall, perhaps early 40s, though there was something ageless in the structure of his face, all sharp angles and centuries of sorrow carved into bone and skin. His hair was dark, silver at the temples. His eyes were pale, almost silver, and they held the weight of looking at too much, surviving too much, enduring too much. He wore black like a second skin, tailored coat, fitted waistcoat, the fabric absorbing light. The only color on him was the deep crimson of a silk cravat at his throat. And his hands, God, his hands. They were beautiful in the way ancient marble is beautiful, cold perfection frozen in an impossible moment. "I'm Lysander Ashford," he said, descending the stairs with an unhurried grace that should have been human but somehow wasn't. "Your blood relation. Your ward, technically, until you come of age to the inheritance. And, though you don't yet know it, your salvation." Evangeline's mouth was dry. Her instincts screamed at her to run the same ancient animal instinct that makes prey aware of predators even in darkness. But his eyes held hers, and in them, she saw something that made running impossible. She saw herself reflected there, but transformed, radiant, eternal. "What is this place?" she whispered. "This," he said, reaching the final step and pausing there, maintaining that crucial distance, "is where your family has always belonged. And this," he gestured to the symbol on the floor, to the candles, to the blackened stones of this impossible house, "is where you will learn that your mother's death was not the end of your story." He smiled then, and his teeth were perfectly human. "It's the beginning," he said softly. Outside, the wind rose over the moors, and Evangeline heard it carry her name not in sound, but in the language of bones and blood and the oldest magics. The blood moon was rising. The prophecy was waking. And in the space between his next breath, she understood. Her mother hadn't been running from this place. She'd been running from him. Sleep came in fractured pieces that night, each one a nightmare wearing a different face. Evangeline lay in a bedroom that had been prepared for her arrival, too prepared, as though she'd been expected not in weeks but in years. The four-poster bed was draped in midnight velvet. Candles burned without seeming to consume themselves. Through the tall windows, the blood moon hung swollen and crimson over the moors, casting everything in shades of rust and old wounds. She dreamed of drowning in red. She dreamed of a voice calling her name in a language that predated words, something older, something that spoke directly to the blood in her veins and made it sing. She dreamed of hands cold as marble, careful as prayer touching her face. She dreamed of fangs, silver in moonlight, and a thirst so profound it swallowed her whole. And then, sometime near midnight, she woke gasping. Lysander stood at her window, silhouetted against the blood moon, and he was exactly as real as her dreams had insisted he be. She should have screamed. She should have reached for the lamp on the nightstand, fumbled for her phone, done something reasonable that a woman alone in a strange house with a strange man should do. Instead, she sat up slowly, pulling the blankets around herself like armor, and she looked at him. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked, her voice steadier than her heartbeat. "Since your breathing changed," he said. His voice was velvet darkness, carefully controlled. "Since you began dreaming of me. I could feel it, the echo of your blood recognizing mine. That's insane." "Yes," he agreed. "But it's also true." He turned from the window then, and in the moonlight, she saw what her waking eyes had refused to fully process downstairs. His beauty wasn't human. It was something older, something that existed in the bones of ancient marbles and in the hymns of long-dead cathedrals. It was a beauty that made her throat ache. "Your mother never told you," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Told me what?" "What you are. What your blood means. Why there are symbols carved into every stone of this house." He moved closer, not approaching, simply existing nearer to her, and she realized that he was being careful, deliberately maintaining distance as though she were something fragile. She was supposed to. Before you reached 21, she was supposed to tell you the truth of the Ashford line. Evangeline's hands curled into fists in the velvet. "My mother told me nothing except not to come here, that it was a cage, that you were—" She stopped, not daring to voice the word that her body already believed. "Dangerous?" His pale eyes found hers across the darkness. "Yes, I am. I have been for 407 years." The number hung in, the air between them like a blade. 407 years. It should have sounded impossible, theatrical, the kind of nonsense a deranged aristocrat whispered to seduce vulnerable women. But the exhaustion in his voice, the weight of those years pressed into every syllable that was impossible to fake. That was the sound of someone who had genuinely lived through centuries. "I don't believe you," she said, but she was lying. "I know." He sat in the chair by the window, maintaining his distance with what seemed like tremendous effort. "Belief will come. What your blood already knows, your mind will eventually accept. It always does." He was quiet for a moment, his pale gaze fixed on the crimson moon. "Your mother was an Ashford by marriage, not by blood. She didn't carry the mark, the genetic memory of what our family is, what we've been for nearly 2,000 years. She was terrified of what you might become. So she ran. She hid you in the mortal world. And she made me promise not to seek you out until she was gone. What would I become?" Evangeline's voice was small. "Everything," he said softly. "And nothing. Human and other. Mortal and potentially eternal." He turned to look at her, and the hunger in his eyes was so carefully banked it appeared as nothing but profound sorrow. "Your bloodline, the true Ashfords, we carry something in our veins that your ordinary human genetics can't explain. A prophecy written in bone marrow and cellular memory. When the blood moon rises in the month of your 21st birthday, the prophecy wakes. It chooses. And your body will begin to change." "Change how?" She hated that her voice was wavering. "Your senses will sharpen. Scents will become languages. Sounds will carry meaning beneath meaning. Your strength will increase. And the hunger." He paused, and she saw him swallow, a very human gesture from something not human. "The hunger will come. For blood, yes, but also for something deeper. For someone whose blood sings in harmony with yours. Are you saying I'm going to become like you? A vampire?" The word hung obscene in the darkness. The candlelight flickered as though the house itself had taken a breath and exhaled it as wind. "The word is imprecise," Lysander said. "We are what remains when divinity and damnation interbreed. Our earliest ancestor was human, a saint, actually, in the old Roman era. He made a bargain with something that had no name in human languages. Power in exchange for hunger. Immortality in exchange for the constant proximity of death. We are the result of that bargain, echoed through generations." He leaned forward slightly. "And you carry that blood, Evangeline. It's waking now. The blood moon is calling to it. And he glanced at the crimson sphere suspended beyond the glass. 5 days, when the moon reaches its zenith, your transformation will either complete itself, or your body will consume itself trying. Trying to what?" But even as she asked, she knew. She could feel it, the strange thrumming in her veins, the way every breath felt like drowning in electricity. "Trying to become what you're meant to be," he said, and the hunger in his eyes deepened. "My blood can stabilize the change, guide it. I've done this before, shepherded others through the threshold. But with you." He stood abruptly, walking back to the window as though he couldn't trust himself in proximity to her any longer. "With you, every instinct I have is screaming at me to bind you, to make you mine before the moon completes its cycle. The pull between our bloodlines is," he pressed his forehead against the cold glass. "It's the old magic, the first magic. It recognizes its match." Evangeline's breath came in short gasps. "What happens if you do that? Bind me? Then you would be mine," he said quietly. "In every way that matters. Our blood would recognize only each other. Our souls would intertwine in ways that humans don't have words for. And his voice cracked, the first sign of true emotion breaking through his careful control. "I would be tied to something I could love forever, and that is the only thing I want, and the only thing I'm terrified to want." He looked back at her then, and his eyes were haunted. "Which is why I'm telling you the truth instead of simply taking it. You have 5 days, Evangeline. 5 days to decide if you want to complete the transformation yourself. Remain human. Live a mortal lifespan. Leave this place and never look back. Or 5 days to decide if you'll let me guide you through, to let our bloodlines recognize each other. And if I leave, then you'll die," he said simply. "Your body has already begun the change. Stopping it now would be like asking your blood to reverse its flow. Without guidance, without another Ashford's power to anchor the transformation, your cells will consume themselves. The hunger will drive you mad. You'll have perhaps 3 months before the end comes." Evangeline stared at him. At this beautiful, terrible man standing in her moonlit bedroom, telling her that she was trapped by her own biology. "That's not a choice," she whispered. "No," he agreed. "It's a mercy, and 5 days to come to terms with it." He moved toward the door, pausing only when his hand touched the frame. Rest, if you can. Tomorrow I'll show you what you are, and perhaps if you don't run screaming, we can discuss what happens next." "Wait," she called out, not knowing what she wanted to ask. He turned, his pale eyes finding hers across the darkness. "Your mother," Evangeline said. "She was terrified of you. But it wasn't because you're a monster, was it?" He was quiet for a long moment, his expression carved from stone and sorrow. "No," he finally said. "She was terrified because she understood that you would love me, that you would have no choice, and that I could make you eternal. And eternal love is the deepest prison of all." The door closed behind him, and Evangeline was left in the candlelight and the crimson glow of the blood moon, her blood singing with recognition for someone she'd met only hours before, her heartbeat falling into rhythm with an ancient hunger she didn't yet understand. Outside, the wind rose, and it carried her name like a prayer, like a curse. Morning in Perdition Hall arrived without sunlight. The sky remained perpetually gray, as though the house existed beneath a ceiling of storm clouds that had learned to be permanent. Evangeline found Lysander waiting in the library, a vast, impossibly high chamber with shelves climbing toward a domed ceiling painted with apocalyptic murals. The shelves held thousands of books, their spines gilded and faded, their pages yellowed with centuries. He was reading when she entered, dressed again in his inevitable black, his silver eyes reflecting candlelight like a predator's in darkness. He didn't look up from his text until she was standing before him. "Medieval theology," he said, closing the tome with careful reverence. "I return to it often, looking for the moment where divinity becomes damnation, or if they were ever truly separate." He gestured to a nearby chair. "Sit. We have much to discuss, and you'll want to be sitting when your questions begin." Evangeline sat, feeling the weight of the house pressing down through its stone and history. "You said you'd show me what I am." "Yes." He set the book on a side table and rose, extending his hand. "But understanding requires more than words. Come." She took his hand without thinking a moment of madness she would later realize, or perhaps inevitability. His skin was cold, smooth as marble, and it burned. Not with heat, but with something electric, something that seemed to light every nerve in her body from the inside. Their fingers connected, and she felt it a vast opening in her consciousness, a presence that was undeniably other, ancient, and hungrily, achingly aware of her. Lysander made a soft sound, half groan, half prayer. "God," he whispered. "Even touching you." He released her abruptly, as though burned. "Forgive me. It's difficult. The closer the blood moon rises, the harder it becomes to remember that you're still human, still fragile." He led her through the manor's corridors, past rooms hung with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow, past alcoves containing objects that radiated age and purpose. They descended a stone staircase that curved downward, away from the world of daylight and rational thought, into the earth itself. The air grew colder, older. It smelled of deep stone and copper and something sweet that made Evangeline's mouth water in ways she didn't understand. They arrived at an iron door marked with symbols that seemed to writhe in the torchlight. Without touching it, Lysander caused it to swing open, willpower manifest as physics, Evangeline realized. He was showing her what she could become. Beyond was a chamber carved from living rock, and, within it, a sanctuary of impossible beauty. The walls were adorned with murals painted in gold and lapis lazuli depicting scenes from theology and carnality intertwined, angels and demons, saints and sinners, all rendered in Renaissance perfection. At the center of the chamber stood a font carved from black marble, filled with a liquid so red it seemed alive. Blood, not freshly taken, but aged, prepared. Evangeline realized she could smell the individual components, could sense the histories contained within it. "This is the chalice of the covenant," Lysander said softly. "Every Ashford keeps one. Every generation adds to it. The oldest of this blood dates to our first ancestor. Centuries of power, of transformation, of choice preserved in this place." He walked to the font and dipped his hand into the liquid. His fingers emerged glowing faintly, luminescent with power that had nothing to do with electricity or science. When he raised them to his throat, Evangeline saw the light, trace through his veins like liquid starlight. "This is what we are," he said. "The physical manifestation of a bargain made so long ago that even I don't remember the saint it was spoken with. We survive on blood, yes, but not in the way human folklore insists. We don't hunt mortals. We don't need to. This blood sustains us. This blood remembers for us. Each time we drink, we're reconnecting with every Ashford who came before, every choice they made, every love they cherished." He turned to face her, and his eyes were now burning with that inner light, pupils dilated and terrible and beautiful. "That's the hunger," he whispered. "Not for death, for connection, for memory, for the sense of belonging to something older than time." Evangeline stepped toward the font without meaning to. Her body knew what her mind was struggling to accept. The smell of the blood was intoxicating, not repulsive, but like approaching something that had been calling to her before she was born. "If I drink," she said slowly, "what happens? You'll taste the memories of everyone who came before you. You'll feel their choices. You'll understand your bloodline not as history but as inheritance. And your body will accelerate its transformation. The hunger will awaken fully." He paused, his expression carefully neutral. "And you'll feel me in the blood. My memories will be the strongest, will be yours to access. You'll know me, Evangeline, as completely as one being can know another." "That's intimacy," she said. "That's vulnerability," he corrected. "That's surrender. That's the closest thing we have to true love, the willingness to let someone else live inside your memories, to judge you by your every choice, and to remain regardless." She looked at the blood in the font, and her veins sang. But she didn't drink. Instead, she asked, "Why did you fall?" His expression shifted surprise, then something like respect. "I was a priest," Lysander said quietly, moving away from the font. 400 years ago, in Rome, I believed in the distinction between good and evil, between the divine and the profane. I was certain of my faith." He laughed, and the sound was bitter as ash. "And then I met a woman, a mortal woman, as you are mortal. She was the daughter of a cardinal, and she was dying of plague. I summoned something, prayed for something. I told myself, though prayer had nothing to do with what answered. I offered my soul for her life. The thing that came accepted the bargain." He turned back to face her, and his eyes held the weight of 4 centuries. "But it didn't ask for my soul," he continued. "It asked for hers, for the exchange of mortality for immortality, for a blood bond that would bind us together for eternity. I became what I am because I wanted to save her from death, and instead, I condemned her to this." He gestured around the chamber. "She lasted 200 years before the weight of memory became unbearable. She chose to walk into sunlight." Evangeline understood then. Understood the sorrow that lived in his bones, the guilt that had been his constant companion across 4 centuries. "You're afraid," she said, "that I'll become her, that immortal love will poison me." "I'm terrified," he said simply. "And I'm terrified of not having the chance to try. I've lived 400 years without belonging to anyone, and now that I've found you, my blood recognizes you. Evangeline, your mother was right. This is a cage, but it's the most beautiful cage I've ever encountered, and I'm not certain I have the strength to keep you from walking into it." He extended his hand again, and this time, she knew what he was offering. Not transformation, not covenant, just choice. "Drink," he said softly, "and then decide. But decide knowing the whole truth, not the beautiful lie of immortal love, but the terrible reality of it. Knowing that I've already waited centuries for you and will wait centuries more, whether you choose me or not." She took his hand. She drank from the chalice of the covenant, and in the space between one breath and the next, she experienced 400 years of longing, of isolation, of beautiful damnation, and she understood that she was already falling. The memories didn't release her until dawn. Evangeline woke on the stone floor of the Covenant chamber, her body trembling with the aftershocks of 4 centuries experienced in compressed time. She could remember things that had never happened to her, the smell of Renaissance Rome, the taste of Renaissance wine, the feeling of Lysander's arms around his first beloved, centuries dead. She could feel the weight of his guilt like her own. When she tried to stand, the world tilted. Lysander caught her, his hands gentle, careful not to let them linger longer than necessary. "It was too much," he said, his voice sharp with self-recrimination. "I should have diluted it, should have given you smaller doses. Your human body isn't ready for—" "I'm not human," she interrupted, her voice strange to her own ears, resonant with harmonics it hadn't possessed before. She could hear his heartbeat, could hear the blood moving through his veins, could hear, at the edge of her perception, the thunder of her own transformation accelerating. "The blood changed me. I can feel it. I can hear you." He released her, stepping back, his pale eyes blazing. "Yes, the transformation is advancing. The blood moon," he looked upward, as though he could pierce through the house's stone ceiling to see the sky beyond. "It's rising to full zenith tonight. We've compressed days into hours. Evangeline looked down at her hands and saw them faintly luminescent, traced with veins that glowed like the rivers of light she'd seen in Lysander's skin. Her fingernails had darkened to obsidian. Her teeth, when she ran her tongue across them, felt sharper. Not fangs, not yet, but moving toward it. "What happens tonight?" she asked. "The prophecy completes," he said quietly. "The choice you've been postponing becomes irreversible. Either you complete the transformation, fully become as we are, tied to blood and shadow and eternity, or your body tears itself apart trying to achieve something impossible." She felt it then, the hunger, real and present, tearing through her like something living. Not for food, but for blood specifically. For the taste of it, the memory it carried, the connection it promised. "I want." She started, then stopped, unable to articulate what her body was demanding. "I know," Lysander said, and he sounded like it was costing him everything to maintain his distance. "The hunger recognizes me. It wants to bind us now, complete the covenant before the moon rises, and if you ask me, I cannot refuse. The blood won't let me." Evangeline looked at him across the chamber, seeing him truly now not as a man, but as an ancient being of power and sorrow, held together by centuries of lonely discipline. She could see the hunger in him that mirrored her own, the desire that transcended the physical because it was inscribed in every cell of his being. She stepped toward him. "Don't," he said, his voice raw. "Evangeline, if you come closer, I won't be able to." She grabbed his wrist and brought his hand to her throat. His fangs descended then, full and terrible and beautiful, and when he looked at her, his eyes were no longer silver but black, all pupil, all hunger, all the predator stripped of pretense. "This isn't consent born of clarity," he said, though his grip on her throat was loosening, not tightening. "This is the blood speaking. This is the prophecy." "Then let the prophecy speak," she interrupted. "I've already tasted your memories, Lysander. I know you in ways that matter, and I want this. I want you. I want to stop being afraid of what I'm becoming and just become it." "You don't understand what you're asking." "Then show me," she said softly. He pulled her close, and she felt the moment his control shattered. His fangs grazed her throat, drawing a thin line of blood, and the sensation was exquisite, not pain but the absence of pain, replaced by something that felt like every nerve in her body singing in unison. The blood flowed, and he drank, and with each pull, she felt something shift inside her. The hunger didn't diminish, it transcended. It became something larger than physical want, something that encompassed his entire being, his entire history, his entire lonely 400-year wait for her. She felt him pour himself into the connection, not just feeding, but giving. His power flowing into her, stabilizing the transformation that her mortal body couldn't achieve alone. Their blood mixing, memories intertwining, prophecy fulfilling itself in the darkness of a covenant chamber beneath a house that had been built specifically for this moment. When he pulled away, they were both changed. Evangeline could see in true darkness, now. Could smell the individual scents contained within the stone, the blood of other Ashfords, the dust of centuries, the magic that had been poured into every surface. She could feel the pulse of Lysander's heartbeat as though it were her own, and when she looked at her hands, she saw them glowing, luminescent with the same inner light that illuminated his veins. "The first binding," Lysander said, his voice shaking. "The connection has begun, but it's not complete. Tonight, when the blood moon reaches its zenith, if you choose, we can complete the covenant fully, can seal ourselves together in a way that transcends blood and becomes something eternal. And if I don't choose, then the connection will fade. You'll complete your transformation as an independent Ashford, free to live as you choose. You can leave this place, live your life without the weight of binding yourself to me." He raised his hand, touching her face with a gentleness that made her chest ache. "But if you do, I'll spend another 400 years waiting, hoping that some future incarnation of your bloodline will recognize me, hoping for a second chance I probably don't deserve." Evangeline leaned into his touch, and she understood something fundamental about immortality then. It wasn't the living forever that was the curse. It was the capacity to love forever, knowing that forever was impossibly long. "Let me think," she said softly, "before the moon rises." He nodded, though she could feel how much the distance cost him. The library became her sanctuary through the day that preceded the night. Evangeline found herself drawn to the oldest volumes records of the Ashford bloodline, written in hands that spanned 4 centuries. She read of their fallen saint, Lysander Ashford, first of their kind, who had given everything for love and gained damnation in exchange. She read of the women who came after, some who accepted the covenant, some who chose to remain free, some who walked into sunlight rather than endure eternity. What struck her most forcefully was the pattern. The women who accepted the binding lasted longest, seemed happiest, found purpose in the eternity they'd been given. But they were also the ones most profoundly transformed by it, their identities subsumed into their vampiric nature, their personhood secondary to their binding. The women who remained free lived centuries alone, powerful but isolated, their immortality without purpose except survival. And then there were the ones who chose to end it. She was reading about Lysander's first love, Catherine, when he found her. The woman's journal was detailed, heartbreaking. Centuries of isolation after Lysander's guilt had driven him to keep his distance. The slow realization that eternal love without the beloved's presence was a form of torture. The final entry, dated in 1847, simply reading, "I walk toward the sun. I walk toward forgetting. I walk toward peace." "You weren't supposed to read those," Lysander said quietly from the library door. Evangeline didn't look up from the journal. "You knew I would?" "Yes." He crossed the distance between them, his movements careful, controlled. "I wanted you to. I wanted you to understand the cost before you made any choice." "Did you love her?" Evangeline asked. "Yes." His voice was hollow. "I loved her so profoundly that I eventually had to leave her, because my presence was killing her slowly." Immortal love is beautiful, Evangeline. It's also selfish. It's asking another being to remain bound to you across centuries when circumstances change, when they change, when the world changes. Evangeline finally looked at him. In the daylight filtered gray through the high library windows, he looked almost human, almost fragile, almost like someone who'd been waiting 400 years and wasn't certain hope was still possible. "Tell me about the ones who stayed," she said. "The ones who found happiness." "Margaret," he said, sitting across from her. "She stayed from 1521 to 1642. We established a library together in Prague, built a sanctuary for other Ashfords who needed refuge. She created a cataloging system for our knowledge that's still in use. When she died of choice, not necessity, but quietly, in winter, surrounded by beauty, she did so, knowing she'd built something that lasted beyond her. That mattered." "What about Elena?" "She's still alive," Lysander said. "In 1603, she accepted the covenant, but she also insisted on maintaining her own pursuits. She became a patroness of the arts, a collector of forgotten knowledge. She has a small estate in Scotland, and she lives by her own rules, bound to me in soul but not in proximity. We see each other perhaps once a decade." "You can do that?" Evangeline asked, surprised. "Bind yourself but maintain independence?" "The covenant is what you make of it," Lysander said. "The old stories, the ones that persist in human culture, they speak of vampire thralls and fide, domination and loss of will. That's propaganda written by humans who feared what they didn't understand. True binding, the kind the Ashfords practice, it's about recognition, about accepting another being as your eternal mirror. But it doesn't require constant proximity, doesn't require subservience." He leaned forward, his pale eyes urgent. "That's what I've been trying to tell you. A binding with me doesn't mean you cease to exist. It means you agree to carry me in your consciousness forever, and I agree to do the same for you. We become each other's internal compass. That's all. That's everything," Evangeline said softly. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." The blood moon rose as twilight fell. Evangeline could feel it, not see it, but feel it in her bones, in her blood, in the way her transformation seemed to accelerate toward some inevitable completion. Her canine teeth had descended fully now, sharp and perfect. Her skin had taken on a luminescence that seemed to emanate from within. Her heartbeat had slowed, becoming something deep and resonant, a rhythm that matched the pulse of the house itself. Lysander appeared in the doorway as the last light faded from the sky, dressed now not in his usual black but in robes of deep crimson, embroidered with symbols that glowed faintly with power. He looked ancient. He looked holy. He looked damned. "It's time," he said. "The blood is calling for completion. You need to decide, Evangeline, here and now, before the moon reaches true zenith. Do you accept the covenant?" She stood, and she could see the hunger blazing in his eyes as he watched her move. And she made her choice. The covenant chamber had been transformed. Where before it had held only the chalice and bare stone, now it bloomed with ritual. Candles burned at cardinal points, each flame a different color: red for blood, white for transformation, black for the death of her human self, silver for the rebirth beyond. The murals on the walls seemed to move in, the candlelight, depicting the covenant again and again, angel and demon, saint and sinner, binding themselves in ecstasy and agony. At the center, the font that held the blood of centuries had been replaced with a larger vessel, a chalice that seemed carved from midnight itself, and it was filled with blood so potent that even from across the chamber, Evangeline could taste it in the air. Lysander stood before it, waiting, his expression stripped bare of all pretense. He looked vulnerable in a way his ancient face wasn't designed to convey, and it only made her love him more. "The covenant requires 3 bindings," he said, his voice formal, ritualistic. "Blood to blood, soul to soul, and finally the eternal binding, the willingness to carry each other across centuries. Do you understand?" "I understand," Evangeline said. "And you choose?" "I choose you," she said simply. "Across whatever centuries this universe grants us, I choose you." His fangs descended fully, and he began to chant words in a language so old it seemed to predate human speech. The candles flared higher. The murals began to glow, and Evangeline felt the magic of the house respond. The ancient magic that had been waiting for an Ashford bloodline to complete its purpose. He drew a ceremonial blade from within his robes, obsidian, worn with centuries of use, and made a small cut across his own throat. The blood that flowed was luminescent, glowing, alive with power. "First binding," he said, and offered his throat to her. She drank, and felt him, truly felt him. Not just the memories, but the essence of his being, his purpose, his deepest self laid bare. She felt 400 years of sorrow, of hunger, of lonely waiting. She felt the moment he decided to accept that he might be damned forever. She felt his capacity for love, vast and patient and eternal. When she withdrew, her vision had changed. The world now existed in layers, the physical, the magical, the spectral, all simultaneous and clear. She could see the threads of power that held the house together, that bound Lysander to this place, that connected him to every Ashford who'd ever lived. Lysander made a second cut, this time across his wrist, and he offered his arm to her. Second binding. Soul to soul, we acknowledge each other. We name each other as the other half of ourselves. As she drank, the boundaries between them began to dissolve. She felt him inside her mind, his consciousness brushing against hers, recognizing itself. And he felt her fear, her hunger, her dawning realization that she didn't want to return to being human, didn't want to be separated from this connection. The moment stretched and became eternal. When he pulled away, he made a third cut, this time across his heart, where blood glowed with such intensity it seemed to contain starlight. He pressed her hand to the wound, and she felt the warmth of his blood, the absolute truth of him as a being of power and hunger and desperate, terrible love. "The final binding," he said, and his voice shook. "Eternal acknowledgement, the willingness to recognize each other across any distance, in any form, in any lifetime. The promise that we remain each other's truth until the universe itself ends. Do you accept?" "I accept," she whispered, and she pressed her mouth to the wound and drank the starlight. The moment his blood touched her tongue, the transformation completed itself. Evangeline felt her human form dissolve and reform, no longer constrained by mortal biology. Her senses expanded impossibly, able to perceive the entire world at once, every heartbeat within 100 miles, every scent, every thread of magic. She could feel the blood moon's power as though it were her own blood, pumping through her veins. But more than that, she could feel Lysander, not as a separate being, but as an essential part of herself. His heartbeat was her heartbeat. His consciousness existed alongside hers, inseparable. She understood now what he'd meant about carrying each other. This was the covenant. Not possession, but perfect recognition. Not loss of self, but expansion of it. "Evangeline," he breathed, and she saw tears on his face. Red tears, blood tears, the only thing a vampire could cry. "You're here. You're really here. The prophecy is complete." She reached for him, and their hands met, luminescent, powerful, ancient. They were the same and different. She was herself but also him. He was himself but also her. And the love that existed in that space was so profound, so complete, that it transcended even the hunger that had once driven them. The candles flared one final time, burning white hot, and in that light, the covenant was sealed. They became each other's eternity, 3 weeks of belonging to each other, and Evangeline had stopped counting time in human measurements. Days and nights blurred into a continuous present, where the only constant was Lysander's presence in her mind. They explored Perdition Hall together, awakening its secrets whole wings she hadn't known existed. Libraries containing knowledge written in languages that predated history, gardens where strange flowers bloomed only under moonlight. They fed together, though not on humans. Lysander's carefully preserved repository of blood collected from willing donors meant they never needed to hunt. They loved each other in all the ways that became possible for beings no longer bound by human biology. But mostly, they existed in the space of finally being understood. And then the arrow came. It pierced through Lysander's chest while they lay together in the morning darkness of their chamber, not a physical arrow, but one tipped with blessed silver and inscribed with words of binding. An attack crafted by someone who understood vampire vulnerability, someone who knew the old magics. Lysander gasped, a sound of surprise more than pain, and Evangeline felt the shock of it reverberate through their connection. "Hunters," he managed. "The Inquisition, they've been tracking us since you arrived." Someone reported but Evangeline was already moving, vampire speed carrying her to the window. Below, on the moors surrounding Perdition Hall, she could see them, a dozen figures in dark clothing, moving with military precision. Humans, but armed with silver and blessed water, and the kind of weapons designed to pierce immortal flesh. "We need to leave," she said, turning back to Lysander. But he was still on the bed. The arrow lodged deep, draining him. Her mind, their shared mind, understood the problem immediately. The arrow was blessed. It was slowly killing him. "I can withstand it," he said, trying to sit up. "The covenant is strong enough." But it wasn't. She could feel the poison spreading through him, feel his power weakening. The arrow had been crafted specifically for this, to disrupt the binding between vampire and soul, to weaken the magic that sustained their kind. "I'm calling for help," she said. Before Lysander could respond, she reached out through the connection they shared to other Ashfords, Elena in Scotland, a network of vampires spread across Europe, all connected through bloodlines and ancient compacts. She sent her desperation through their shared consciousness, felt it reach them like a scream in the dark. The response came within minutes, not physical rescue, but magical amplification. She felt other Ashfords pouring their power through her, strengthening her own, giving her access to abilities that 400 years of practice should have granted Lysander, but that she possessed only through borrowed strength. She moved through the house faster than the hunters could track her, sealing entrances with words of binding, raising the magic that dwelled within Perdition Hall's stones. The mortal attackers, sophisticated as they were, couldn't compete with the kind of power a vampire sanctuary could yield. But the arrow remained, lodged in Lysander's chest, and nothing she did could dislodge it. One of the hunters managed to breach the eastern wing, and Evangeline found herself facing him, a woman, perhaps 60, with gray hair and eyes that held the particular coldness of someone who'd spent a lifetime hunting the supernatural. "You're one of them," the woman said, and her voice held a sadness that made Evangeline pause. A human turned. "How long do you think you'll remain yourself, creature? How long before the hunger consumes your humanity entirely?" "I'm exactly as human as I need to be," Evangeline said, "and I'm not letting you have him." They fought, and it was like nothing Evangeline had experienced. The hunter moved with the precision of decades of training, striking at pressure points, using blessed weapons that burned when they contacted Evangeline's skin. But Evangeline was faster, stronger, and more desperately motivated. She disarmed the woman, felt herself on the edge of delivering the kill. Strike felt the hunger rising to take what it was offered. And she stopped. "Leave," she said instead. "Tell whoever sent you that Perdition Hall is no longer vulnerable. That every vampire in Europe now knows of this attack. That consequences will follow." The hunter woman looked at her with something like respect. "Then he truly has redeemed himself," the woman said quietly. "If he's capable of inspiring that kind of restraint." She turned and left, limping, leaving no more attacks behind. By the time Evangeline returned to their chamber, the arrow had stopped draining Lysander, but the damage was done, his power was diminished, his immortal form weakened. Not mortally wounded, but seriously harmed. "Why didn't you kill her?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Because you didn't," Evangeline said simply. 400 years, and you've maintained your humanity by refusing unnecessary killing. I'm not going to lose that just because I'm new to immortality." She climbed into bed beside, him, careful of the wound, and pulled him close. In the silence, their heartbeats synchronized. She understood something fundamental about the covenant. It wasn't about creating identical beings. It was about choosing the other's values, even when it was difficult. "The hunters will return," Lysander said. "I know," Evangeline whispered, "but we'll face them together." The blood moon continued to rise, indifferent to mortal violence and immortal devotion. The healing required something Lysander had never demanded in 400 years. "I need to drink from you," he said 3 days after the arrow's impact, when his voice had become barely more than a whisper and his luminescence had dimmed to something almost human. "Not the way we feed on preserved blood. Directly. From the vein." Evangeline understood what he was asking. To drink from the source of her power, to consume her vitality in order to restore his own. It was the deepest form of vampire feeding, intimate, dangerous, and, in the wrong hands, deadly. "Then drink," she said simply. She took him to the covenant chamber, where the ritual had been performed. The candles still burned there, maintained by the magic of the place, casting their colored light across the stone. She didn't undress, didn't prepare herself with anything except acceptance. She simply offered her wrist and waited. When Lysander's fangs pierced her vein, the sensation was different from any feeding she'd experienced before. There was no hunger in it, no predatory nature. Instead, it was a kind of surrender that felt sacred. She felt him drinking not just her blood, but her strength, her will to survive, her determination to protect him. She felt him taking what he needed, and she felt the pain of it, not physical, but spiritual, the depletion of something essential, given willingly. And she felt him weeping as he drank. "I'm sorry," he said directly into her mind. The words carried through the connection that made them one. Consciousness. "I should never have allowed this. Should never have brought you here, bound you to me. You're suffering because of my choices." "No," she said back. "I'm suffering because hunters attacked. That's not your doing. And I'm not suffering, I'm choosing." She felt herself weakening as he fed, felt the edges of her consciousness beginning to blur. For a moment, she understood the danger, the way vampire feeding could become death, the way love could transform into predation without warning. But then Lysander pulled away, gasping, his wounds already beginning to mend. The luminescence returned to his eyes, his skin, his veins, and in his expression, she saw the horror of what he'd almost done. "No more," he said. "Not like this. Never again." He pulled her close, cradling her against his chest, and through their connection, Evangeline felt him pouring his own strength back into her, restoring what he'd taken. It was an act of repentance made physical, a vampire acknowledging the weight of his hunger and consciously choosing restraint. When she'd recovered enough to stand, Evangeline looked at him and understood that this moment had changed something fundamental in their covenant. It had tested it, and it had held. "We need to leave Perdition Hall," Lysander said quietly. "The hunters know where we are. More will come, and I won't have you trapped here because of me. Where will we go?" Evangeline asked, but she already knew the answer. It was in his mind, had been forming there since the first arrow struck. "Everywhere," he said. "We'll travel. We'll build a life that doesn't depend on a single location. Elena has already offered her estate in Scotland as a temporary refuge. After that, we can move as we choose. The covenant allows it. We don't need to remain bound to place if we remain bound to each other." Evangeline felt a surge of something that might have been joy, if joy could exist for creatures that transcended human emotion. The idea of leaving the Gothic isolation of Perdition Hall, of moving through a world she was still learning to perceive, with someone who would never leave her. "It sounds like freedom," she said through their connection. "It sounds like love," Lysander corrected, "which is its own kind of captivity, but a beautiful one." They spent one final night in Perdition Hall, walking through its corridors, saying goodbye to the place that had been their cocoon of transformation. Evangeline could see the magic that lived in the stones, could understand that the house itself was a form of consciousness, ancient, protective, designed generations ago for precisely what had just occurred. When dawn came, or what passed for dawn in this season of gray skies, they left. Lysander drove while Evangeline sat in the passenger seat, watching the moors pass, feeling the wind that carried the scent of worlds she'd never known. They drove south, toward Elena's Scottish estate, toward whatever came next, and in the space between them, their connection hummed with the particular contentment of beings who'd found their other half and were willing to pay any price to keep them. Elena's estate was not a house, but a statement, a sprawling Victorian mansion on the Scottish coast, perched on cliffs that looked down into waters dark as spilled wine. She was waiting for them on the stone steps when they arrived, a woman who appeared to be in her 40s but whose eyes held the weight of 400 years. "Welcome," she said to Evangeline, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. "I've been expecting you." Lysander finally found what he was waiting for. She embraced him, and Evangeline felt their connection deep, affectionate, but lacking the intensity of a blood covenant. It was the embrace of allies who'd survived centuries together, rather than lovers. Over the following weeks, Evangeline began to understand the true scope of vampire existence. There were more Ashfords than Lysander had mentioned, a global network, centuries old, carefully maintaining their presence through positions of power and influence. There were councils, traditions, hierarchies of blood and age, and there were rules. The greatest of them was simple. The hunt was permitted, but murder was not. Humans could be fed upon, were meant to be fed upon, but always with permission, always with care, always with compensation. The Ashfords had evolved beyond the savage predation that human folklore imagined. Evangeline met others of her kind for the first time, and she understood that she and Lysander were not unique in their covenant. There were other bonded pairs scattered across the globe, other immortals who'd found their matching halves and bound themselves for eternity. But none of the bonds were quite like hers and Lysander's. "It's the guilt," Elena explained one evening as they sat in the manor's library, watching the northern lights paint the sky in shades of green and silver. "He's carried it for so long, the death of his first beloved, the centuries of isolation, that when he finally found someone he could truly love without reservation, the universe arranged it so the love was equally desperate, equally transcendent." "You mean we're bound more deeply than others?" Evangeline asked. "I mean that he'll move heaven and earth to keep you safe, and you'll be willing to walk through fire to stay with him. It's not the most common outcome." Elena smiled, and there was sadness in it. "Usually, it's less dramatic. Usually, love settles into something manageable. But you two, you're the kind of covenant that lasts until the stars die." The hunters came again, 3 months after their arrival in Scotland. This time, Evangeline was ready. She'd spent the months learning to use her powers, understanding the depths of her new nature. She could hear heartbeats across kilometers, could see in absolute darkness, could move faster than human eyes could track, and she could feel the minds of other Ashfords through their shared bloodline, could call upon their strength when needed. When the attack came, she didn't run. She stood beside Lysander on the cliffs overlooking the sea, and together, they demonstrated what an ancient vampire lord and his newly bound covenant were capable of. The hunters fled, leaving behind weapons and the knowledge that Perdition Hall wasn't the source of their power. They were. "How long do you think they'll keep coming?" Evangeline asked as they watched the hunters' vehicles disappear across the moorland. "Until they stop being afraid," Lysander said. "The Inquisition has hunted our kind for centuries. Some of them are certain we're demons. Others believe they're performing a religious duty. A few of them might actually be right." "Are you?" she asked. "A demon?" He considered it, his silver eyes reflecting moonlight. "I was a priest who made a terrible bargain. I became a vampire, which, depending on your theology, is either punishment or damnation. So, by some definitions, yes. But I've also spent 400 years refusing to be the monster humans believe me to be." He looked at her. "And then you came, and you made choosing good easier. So perhaps I'm redemption disguised as damnation." "That's very poetic," Elena called from the manor window. "But we have guests arriving from London. The council wants to formally recognize the new binding. Come inside before you catch your death, or whatever the expression is for people like us." The council meeting took place in Elena's grand hall, and for the first time, Evangeline saw the true scope of their kind. Ashfords from across Europe, some she recognized from old paintings in Perdition Hall's libraries, some who claimed to be older than recorded history. They came to witness the covenant, to acknowledge the new binding, to celebrate the continuance of their bloodline. And in their presence, Evangeline understood something crucial. She wasn't just bound to Lysander, she was bound to an entire history, an entire community, an entire existence that transcended the small, mortal world she'd left behind. "Do you regret it?" Lysander asked that night. As they lay together in the chamber Elena had given them, modern and comfortable, lacking the Gothic weight of Perdition Hall. "Leaving behind mortality? Missing sunlight? Never aging another day?" Evangeline considered it honestly. "No, but I do regret that my mother couldn't see this. that she couldn't understand that the cage she was running from wasn't a prison. It's a sanctuary. She was trying to protect you, Lysander said softly. Mothers have been doing that since before our kind existed. I know, Evangeline said. And I love her for it. But love isn't protection. Love is choosing each other anyway. Lysander pulled her closer, and she felt their heartbeats synchronize, his ancient pulse and her newer rhythm finding harmony. Outside, the Scottish winter grew deeper. Inside, they were warm with the particular heat that only immortal things understood. The following spring brought a proposal that would have seemed impossible to Evangeline 6 months before. I want to expand the sanctuary, Lysander said, and she felt the idea bloom in his mind before he spoke the words. Perdition Hall serves its purpose, but it's isolated. We could create something larger, a place where newly turned Ashfords could be guided through their transformation by someone who understands, a place where hunters and hunted could learn to coexist. You want to change the world? Evangeline said. I want to stop leaving it to chance, he replied. For centuries, our kind have hidden, adapted, survived in the spaces between human civilization. But the world is changing. Humans are learning things, developing technologies that will make hiding harder. I want to build a bridge instead of a wall. The council was skeptical at first. Several of the older Ashfords believed that revelation was death, that exposure would lead to persecution. But Lysander and Evangeline presented their vision together, and their covenant new and therefore still burning with the intensity of completion won them over. They returned to Perdition Hall that summer, not as refugees but as architects. The renovation took 3 years. They expanded the eastern wing, created wings for visiting Ashfords, developed a library that would rival any university collection. But most importantly, they established a center for education, a place where humans could come to learn the true nature of vampirism, where hunters could be taught restraint, where cooperation could replace persecution. It was during those years of building that Evangeline learned what immortality truly meant. It wasn't the endless years, though. Those came. It was the patience that accumulated with them, the way you could work on a single project for 3 years without feeling the weight of time. It was the ability to love someone more deeply, with each passing season, because you were never rushing toward mortality, never accepting that it might be cut short, and it was discovering dimensions of herself that mortal existence had never allowed. She became a scholar, delving into the archives of Ashford history, writing treatises on vampire lore and the true nature of the covenants. She became a teacher, guiding newly turned Ashfords through their transformations, showing them that the hunger didn't have to define them. She became a diplomat, working with local authorities, proving that vampires could be citizens, not criminals. And throughout it all, Lysander was there, not as her master or her guide, but as her equal, her partner, her eternal mirror. On their 5-year covenant anniversary, Lysander gave her a ring. Not an engagement ring, they'd moved beyond such mortal ceremonies, but a binding ring, forged from silver and inscribed with the words of their covenant in a language that predated alphabets. This is a formality, he said as he slipped it onto her finger. We're already bound in every way that matters. But I wanted something that marked it, something that other Ashfords would recognize as a union sealed in blood. I love you, Evangeline said, and it still felt inadequate to describe the depth of what she felt. Their minds were linked, their hearts synchronized, their very beings intertwined in ways that transcended love into something more fundamental. But it was still the closest human word she possessed. I know, he said. I feel it every moment. The same way you feel my love not as something external, but as the ground beneath your feet, as the air you breathe. That night they returned to the Covenant Chamber beneath Perdition Hall for the first time since their binding. The candles still burned there, kept alight by magic even in their absence, and they performed a renewal ceremony, nothing required by Ashford law, but something intimate, a recommitment to each other, performed in the same space where their transformation had been completed. Do you regret it? Evangeline asked, echoing a question Lysander had asked her years before. Creating me? Turning me into something no longer human? Every day, he said, and she felt the truth of it through their connection. And never for a moment. The regret comes from the centuries I spent alone, waiting for you. The knowledge that I could have been with you longer if I'd had the courage to build something other than walls and solitude. But you couldn't have, Evangeline said, understanding it as completely as she understood her own thoughts. You were waiting for me to be ready, for the prophecy to ripen, for the universe to align. Do you believe in the prophecy now? He asked. I believe in choices, she said. And I believe that the universe responds to intention. You spent 400 years intending to find love, and the universe conspired to deliver it. That's prophecy enough for me. The years after that became a blur of transformation and growth. Perdition Hall evolved from a Gothic sanctuary into something that humans might recognize as a research facility or an educational institution. The hunters either killed themselves trying to penetrate it, or they learned to negotiate. The Ashfords became semi-public figures, carefully controlled, but present. Vampire literature began to shift from mythology to documentary, from fear to understanding. And through it all, Evangeline and Lysander remained at the center, their covenant becoming the template for how vampire relationships could exist in a changing world. Other bindings formed using their model partnerships based on equality rather than possession, covenants that allowed independence alongside connection. The new Ashfords who came of age seemed less tortured by their nature, less inclined toward the predatory darkness that had characterized earlier generations. "We're changing the species," Elena observed one evening, visiting from her Scottish estate. "Whether intentionally or not, you've set in motion something revolutionary." "Is that good or bad?" Evangeline asked. "That's still to be determined," Elena said with a smile. "But it's certainly interesting. 50 years after their binding, something changed in the world. Not the world itself, but humanity's relationship with the supernatural. The internet had exposed too many secrets. Videos of vampire strength, recordings of immortal beings, generations of humans growing up with the knowledge that creatures of myth were real. It couldn't be suppressed any longer. There was chaos, there was fear, and there was, unexpectedly, acceptance. A new generation of humans grew up with vampires as neighbors, teachers, lovers. The covenant that Lysander and Evangeline had pioneered, one based on choice and understanding rather than dominance and fear, became the model adopted across the globe. It was in this moment of unprecedented acceptance that they made their next choice. "I want to formally step down as the head of Perdition Hall," Lysander announced to the gathered councils. "I want to pass the responsibility to the next generation." The reaction was shock. In the Ashford hierarchy, he was the eldest, the most powerful, the one whose will had shaped their existence for centuries. The idea of him relinquishing power was nearly unthinkable. "I'm not abandoning responsibility," he clarified. "I'm evolving it. For 400 years, I've built walls to protect our kind. Now it's time to build bridges. That requires a different kind of leadership than military hierarchy allows." The new director was Marcus, an Ashford turned 200 years prior, young enough to understand the modern world but old enough to command respect. He was brilliant, idealistic, and when Lysander formally passed the sigil of office to him, the transition was seamless. Evangeline understood what this meant for Lysander. It meant acknowledging that his centuries as the patriarch had reached their natural conclusion. It meant accepting that others could carry the burden he'd borne alone. It meant, finally, allowing himself to simply exist rather than constantly lead. That autumn, they left Perdition Hall. Not forever. They maintained chambers there, made periodic returns for council meetings and ceremonies, but they set out into the world in a way Lysander hadn't done since the 1800s. They traveled to places where their kind gathered, to universities where humans studied the nature of vampire existence, to cities where the integration of humans and immortals was most advanced. And they fell in love again, repeatedly, in different ways, in different places. In Paris, they danced in underground clubs where humans and vampires mingled freely. In Tokyo, they walked through neon-lit streets holding hands without fear. In Sao Paulo, they visited with other bound pairs and shared their story, learning that love transcended all, cultures and continents. But the deepest change came internally. Evangeline realized, on a night in Buenos Aires, when she and Lysander were watching the Southern Cross rise above the city, that she had stopped thinking of herself as separate from him. The covenant had deepened beyond the initial binding into something that resembled true union. When she thought, he was present in her thoughts. When he felt pain, she bore part of it. They had become less two beings in relationship and more like a single consciousness expressed through two bodies. "Is this what the ancient ones meant by soulmates?" she asked him. "Perhaps," he said. "Though I think it's something different. Soulmates might be predestined, might be written into the fabric of the universe from birth. What we have is constructed through choice and repetition. We became soulmates by choosing each other every single day for 50 years. Will we keep choosing?" she asked. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Eternity is a long time," Evangeline. I was alone for 400 years before you, and I survived it. I don't know what will happen if we separate, or if we'll eventually want to. All I know is that right now, in this moment, with you, I've never been more complete. That's enough, she said, and meant it. That night, they made love in a hotel overlooking the Rio Plata, and it was both completely new and infinitely familiar. Every time they touched, it was a reiteration of their covenant, a recommitment spoken through skin and blood, and the synchronized beating of immortal hearts. When they finished, they lay in darkness, and Evangeline could feel the pulse of her own vitality, the way her transformed body maintained itself through neither breath nor heartbeat, but through pure will and the ancient magic that sustained their kind. "Thank you," Lysander whispered into her hair. "For what?" she asked. "For choosing me, for not walking into the sunlight, for showing me that redemption isn't just a spiritual concept. It's something that can be loved, can be held, can be carried for eternity. Thank you for waiting," she said in return, "for being patient through all those centuries, for building a world where I could exist as I am, without apology or shame." In the darkness of their hotel room, they held each other, and the blood moon ever present, ever watchful, looked down on them with something that might have been blessing. 100 years after their binding, Evangeline returned to the graveyard where her mother was buried. Lysander stood beside her, his presence a constant warmth in her mind, as she knelt on the grass and traced her mother's name on the stone. 100 years had passed in what felt like a single long breath, centuries for her consciousness, but years for the rest of the world. Her mother had died afraid, believing that immortal love was a trap. Evangeline had spent the first 2 decades of her new existence resenting that fear, resenting the way it had colored her inheritance. But now, after a century of eternity, she understood. Her mother had been right. Immortal love was a trap, but it was also a sanctuary, a cage and a cathedral both, a prison and a paradise arranged in perfect, terrible balance. "I forgive her," Evangeline said aloud, and she felt Lysander's hand rest on her shoulder. "I understand now that she wasn't trying to protect me from you. She was trying to protect you from the weight of loving someone who could never leave you." "I never wanted her forgiveness," Lysander said softly. "I only wanted her to be at peace knowing that you were safe." They left the graveyard as twilight descended, and they walked through human cities where the living hurried about their mortal concerns, unaware that immortality moved among them. They passed through places transformed from Evangeline's memories, some destroyed, some rebuilt, all fundamentally changed by the passage of decades. That night, in a hotel in London not far from where Evangeline had once worked as a mortal museum curator, they renewed their covenant again. The renewal ceremony had become ritual by now, performed annually, sometimes more frequently if either of them felt the binding weakening. It required no grand chamber, no ancient magic. It required only their presence, their intention, and the willingness to choose each other again. They performed it simply, in the privacy of their room, speaking vows that had evolved and deepened across a century. "I choose you," Lysander said, his voice carrying the weight of 409 years of existence, not because the prophecy demands it, not because the blood requires it, but because every morning I wake, I choose to exist in the world you inhabit. I choose to build my eternity alongside yours, knowing that forever is long enough for us to grow beyond recognition, and long enough for me to love you in every new form you take. "I choose you," Evangeline said, speaking to the ancient being she'd married, who had become her anchor to existence itself. "Not because fear binds me, not because desperation chains me, but because I cannot imagine a universe where we're not intertwined. I choose to carry you in my consciousness forever, to share your joys and sorrows, to be the eternal mirror that reflects your soul back to you, unchanged and unchanging." And in that moment, as it had happened 100 times before, their covenant renewed itself. The connection between them flared bright, burning away any accumulated distance or doubt, leaving only the pure core of what they'd built together. Afterward, they stood at the window of their hotel room, looking out at London's lights, and Evangeline felt something shift in her understanding. She had once feared immortality, had once believed it was a curse, an unending hunger that would eventually consume her. But she'd been wrong. Immortality wasn't an endless succession of days. It was the ability to build meaning that lasted longer than a single human lifetime. It was the capacity to love someone so deeply that the love itself became a kind of immortality, not of body, but of significance. It was creating something that mattered, that persisted, that continued to echo through centuries. Perdition Hall had evolved into a place of learning and healing. The Ashfords had become teachers instead of monsters. A new generation had grown up understanding that immortality didn't require darkness, only choice. And she and Lysander had become the model for how eternity could be lived with joy instead of despair. "What's next?" Evangeline asked, looking at the man who'd been waiting 400 years for her, and who would wait 400 years more if necessary. "I don't know," Lysander said, and there was wonder in his voice. "For centuries, I had goals, survival, adaptation, finding you. Now that I've found you, now that we've built something lasting, I'm not entirely certain what immortality is supposed to look like. Maybe it's this," Evangeline said. "Maybe it's just existing, growing, changing, loving, not in service of some grand purpose, but for the sake of the living itself." He pulled her close, and she felt their hearts synchronize, not metaphorically, but literally, the ancient magic of their binding causing their physical bodies to resonate in harmony. "Then let's be content," he said. "Let's be simply, eternally, completely content." Outside, the blood moon continued its eternal orbit. It had risen to mark their beginning, would rise again and again across whatever centuries lay ahead, and with each rising, it would find them changed and growing, renewed and deepening, eternally bound and eternally free. Because that was what the old magic understood. Love wasn't about possession, it was about evolution. The ability to be transformed by another being so completely that you became someone new, and then to choose that new self again, over and over, for eternity. In a London hotel room, with a window facing out toward all the futures they would live together, Lysander and Evangeline held each other, and the city lights reflected off their luminescent skin like scattered stars. The covenant was sealed. The prophecy was complete, and immortal love, after all, was not a curse. It was a beginning that never ended.